I will need a moment to explain how this prototype works so I can show you how to check if a GameObject has a certain component assigned to it. Here I have two spheres. One of them has a script called player and the other has a script called enemy. The spheres also have a rigid body component, so when we press play, they will fall and hit this plane. The plane has a collider and a script in which I define the onCollisionEnter event. This function will be automatically triggered when a collider touches the plane. For a more in-depth analysis on how the onCollision events work, check this other video in the corner. Inside this function, we print the name of the GameObject that we detect in the collision. So if we run this, we see that we can detect both GameObjects, the player and the enemy. Now, the idea is to know if the object that hits the plane has a player script or an enemy script, so we can make different actions depending on the case. In particular, if the object is the player, we will destroy it, and if the object is the enemy, we're gonna make it bounce. So, one way to check if a GameObject has a certain component could be to get the component from the GameObject, store it in a local variable, but don't use it unless that component is different from null. Something like this. If player script is different from null, then destroy the GameObject that has the player script assigned to it. If we run this, we see that the player is destroyed while the enemy remains because it hasn't a player script assigned to it. And also notice that there aren't any errors in the console, something that won't happen if we don't check if the component is different from null and we directly try to use it. Here the error was triggered by the enemy because we tried to use a player script assigned to the enemy GameObject, which doesn't exist, so better check if that component exists before using it. Let's see another method to check if a GameObject has a certain component assigned to it, that is not to get a component, but try to get a component. And let's use it for the enemy script. For that, we define a local enemy variable, in this case we can call it enemy script, and then define a Boolean variable called hasComponent. We will initialize this variable with the following instruction. The GameObject that collides dot try get component indicate the component between the angled brackets, just like the getComponent function, but instead of open and close parentheses, we're gonna write out and our enemy variable. So if this variable is true, it means that the object indeed has an enemy component, and in that case, it will be stored in this variable. So if hasComponent, then we can make whatever we want with that component. As I mentioned before, we will make the enemy bounce. So for that, we could use the enemy script variable and with the dot access to the GameObject, and then we could get the rigid body component from that GameObject and finally apply it an impulse to that rigid body. We could also make the same as before, store the rigid body component in a local variable and check if it's different from null before using it. Now, if you run this, you can see the result. Subscribe to this channel so we can see each other again in the next video.